dawn. I'll show you the creation of the new world.
Hello there, how's it going? So yeah, today we're gonna be talking about a topic that has been really rather more controversial on the side of the spectrum. So in this video we're gonna be basically talking about the biggest scam in the world. And of course I know before you guys are even gonna see the video, some of you are gonna just straight up dislike it. Because obviously, man, I mean, this is the controversial topic, but without any further ado, I'm just gonna get into the topic right away. From now on, I'm gonna actually start to give timestamps for my longer videos so that you people can enjoy it in small bits and it is easily digestible. You know, the classic, the feeding process. You do it in small bites. You don't just gulp it down. So it is just like that. Here's the index and the timestamps will be given in the description. Let's just continue right away. So at first we're gonna be talking about scams and frauds. Now, for in this very instance, I am to know that you are to have a general idea of what scams are to infer. It is more so to do with loss of assets to morph or transform into the ray of liability, that is money and monopoly. As in monopoly, you are to either lose or gain. It is rather a unpredictable amount of money that is put into a bet and is rather similar to stocks and yet is different from it. Let us just work on the assumptive that scams are to do with devastation of your castle of virtuous expectations when virtuous, or rather we could say good expectations, when not fitting into your very standards of expectations, to barge in with the new reality, harsh reality you were forced to endure. Now moving on to frauds, this is basically the general wave that scams are to ride onto, yet the mechanisms fulfilled by this very equation of displacement of virtues. What this variable in it is in a linear equation is rather a possession of characteristics or syntaxes that are to consist of internal deception, as most of you humans are to associate as of a negative infliction. The outcomes that are the final appeal in the starkness of a market are that of the antonym of security, to get unfair and unruly again. Now again, these are more of a monopoly or of monetary declines that are incessant each time it is to be utilized. And now moving on to the next node of this composite is the precursors of the corruption. First, to understand that, I am to give my dissent at the start instead of giving it in the end. For this aspect of the element in my chain of compounds, or for you to infer from or interpret to get the nodes of your dissent. As is corruption, it is the negative usage and overdrive of the wheels of power. It can or may drive a creature even if I were to exempt humans beyond any form of laws or rules to be bound to, for even the vacuum that binds it is to dissipate. So, are these the precursors of corruption in this ballad? That is a yes and no under my volition. But my note or point is that these are what led to the desolation of virtues and the rallies of corruption in my own dissent. Now, next on the spectrum, we have betrayal. And to ask what is the betrayal, we are to divide it in two sections. So, in this ballad, there are all sorts of melancholy to dance around in our very cups of realities. There are all sorts of betrayal to be cited from the eye of something yet not. And this what comes from the ideals of the ideologies. Now this variant in a bubble is reminiscent to the character of cancer and not the constellation to be approximate. It is to deviate from its purpose just as chaos is to do from the hyperbole of order. What I mean to propagate is yet not going to be precisely and completely articulated in this picturesque of a film. But my note is that the mentality is to beware of for that is the epicenter of all corruption as noted at previously. Here is where all is to get a backstory as an amendment of a pillar to support the heights of a bridge. This is the epicenter and nexus of this very hindrance, as the origin is yet to guide the steerings of the coordination as in geometry. Normally, to understand and comprehend the very code of the equation, we must travel to its past to get data and metamorph its terminals to knowledge. This very nuance of a notion has no accurate mark of an origin, which is to mean that I or we, or to be or to presume upon the rules of assumptions, it is said that for the majority of our existences, we are to retain our mental characteristics, which can mean that we are to develop a gradual capacity of ideas that fuel our mentalities whilst at our vessels. This is to show that even a fracture or crack in our vessels of understanding the ideals of elsewise realities can prove apocalypses. For example, we can always have a natural tendency to grind onto a desire, but it is the some other biological mechanism as an organism to prove or acknowledge for our very nature of desire. To be precise, we are going to dive into the more like constructive example, which is that we, or let us to say you, are to grasp onto the desire to utilize an instrument, but another one of your companions are to either reject or ignore your desire for that instrument. It is to do with natural and over time nurturing of the very bowl of mentality. Now, the next one in the spectrum is propagandum. Now, this is of a deviated subject of a matter from the prelude of the previous one. That is to say, how we are to be always toyed with and tinkered around to an anchor, twisted and told we are to become instead of sticking by to a certain sail of a boat. For that is propagandum, and how we are to be fooled into the metrics of brainwashism. In this field, each step you are to take, for there is no reality of absolution or repentance, for you are to distrust and disperform in ways that deviate the very climate of your instance. What I am to convey in this elongation of a passage is that in this equation there is always a variable or a cause that is to make you function in ways to their climate and not to your volition. For your freedom is to abstain from you at this instant. Now the outcome, which is to plight my very self onto the next note of the symphony, the consequence of an outcome. For if you are to abstain from what has been imposed and inflicted upon you, then you are to learn and get nothing from the variables that have zipped and passed by. That is to say, there is a dark outcome of negative notions to take a dive into. For example, we are to always yearn and experiment for a variable or for some substance to be content with or to find purpose in. But if the obstruction of one's different method of mentality shifts into your very focus, then you are to abstain from the incomplete variable of the purpose you were to build your fortress upon. If, or to be precise, we are to say, one is to make you dive in for a calculative aspect ratio of thought and with forced measures to be inflicted upon you when you are to tend to think in a literature orientation of thought. Then when this obstruction is to happen, you may abstain and lapse away from your experiment with literature. Now moving on to the could be truth. I'm going to divide this into two sections, for it is in the favor of merits and demerits. Now at first we of course have the very element of gateway to the real life or the real world. Now I'm not to be in total denial from the very separate cups of notions of this segment that is to present itself. Real life, the term itself is often coined from the very realities us humans are to live into, as in for a collective manner. But this isn't to be a veracious completion of a statement for itself. At the very least, not yet. For all of our, as humans, collective or a single nuance of a reality has differing syntaxes of variables, and this is the very enigmatic reason as to why the term coined is to be rather subjective and very vague. And what I am to convey is that in this very globalized epitome of A or R world, education is the main constant expression compression in this variable. You could also call it a expression, for it is just that, of R or mine, my very nebula of life. For here you are to learn all that you are to need in your arsenal to pass through into the realm of collective real lives as in a plural manner. If you are to check a concrete solid rawness of the definition of ecstasy, whether it is to be that of online via Google or Bing, or even traditionally scouring the surfaces of dictionaries, now this is to give you the very reminiscence to that of a systematic instruction that is to be given for ecstasy, that is, i.e., bliss and euphoria, for that is the very definition of this array of a segment. A node is to meander around in reminiscence to that of a viper. For example, you are to cherish one part of the aspects of a system, you are to lock and unlock yourself back and forwards, for that is the notion of the very slightest aberration of emotion, of the nostalgia that is to be put onto your gullet. If I am to voice forth one's yearning for his cherishment of nostalgia regarding to that of playing the very realistic sports, whilst at a system such as that of traditional schools, then it is to mean a lot for that one individual as in a meander circulatory of nostalgia. Now, moving on to the protective life security aspect, here is where one's reality, where it is to frown upon the eerie structural mechanism of life, is to converge into where one entity of collective realities. Coming into the direct apex of my presented fourth argument, education at some degree or exponent of a notation is to give a warranty code which is nigh or close to that of your protection, with life security being inclusive, like a suffix, for this is also an important variable in this equation of a videotape I am to create forth. Your life is to be into the arms of security. If you are to take a supplement of a systematic education, that i.e. college, office, school, or even tuition, as this segment is to focus and attribute only to the merits, the very gravel structure of secure livelihood is to give you, as the very moral identity is to suggest unto forth, protective security to face any hurdle that is to plummet onto your facials of reality. Now moving on to the demerits, in this segue of a segment that is to transition via travel through Hyperloop, well that it was a little too much of an exaggeration in there, but my point is that you are to ponder, or once in your very enigma of a lifetime, you were to somewhat doubt that, why in our very blue bowl of a globe most of the so-called geniuses are all to be dropouts. Now before I am to go into the next node of this equation, I must put forth a quick and minuscule of a disclaimer, that is, that in this short film I am to only mostly reflect upon the schools of today, but as of 2021, of course, most schools are either closed or are most likely and very much hosted on the online network of the internet. Yes, as to the question I have put forth to most likely create discourse within, but in this note there is more to the answers to this simplistic question, or they are to only become mere statues or suspended doubts? For the answer, I must say there is no usual vivid looking glass that is to be exempt from further cleaning once out of your attic. Instead, it is to be that most likely they were to leave at either an early tenure of school life or as further to the college livelihood counterpart, because of the lapse and this cold death of creativity. For there is no definite or satisfactory exposure of promotion and appreciation for creativity. Even if it is to be very likely, it is not to be satisfactory in most instances and rather scanty. For example, let us to take an artificial but not realistic situation where one is to have a talent, to have an aptitude for something, but the public, i.e., the people at school, are to rather inflict only negativity for hate and only negative criticism to such a degree that for one to just exempt oneself from the entirety of the ecosystem of the school. Now, this is just to be a rather foundation of a mere hypothesis, but there is more to this equation yet to be comprehended upon. Let's just now say that one is to have a talent of that is music, but the students and teachers at the very school are to only give hate to such an extent that the child is to run away from the ecosystem of the school itself, maybe even forever. Moving on to the next point, we have humans, robots, morphosis. Humans are to be flawed and mere concentrations of fallacies, for that is via this point is to come into the occurrence of unsurmountable amounts of follies, and you must forgive me, for we travel onto the same boat. This is to be a raw deduction, yet, but as of this very moment, I would rather coin the term premature for it. In this hypothesis of a flip scenery, the human is to, or is most likely to become that of reminiscence of a mere computing robot. Henceforth has the term apparated out of naught. No, I must say this has happened before in a very collective and corporate reality. For in many systems that are to thrive and live for, efficiency is a must, and for that it to occur, there is to be a manufactured procedure in monotony called productivity. In my deduction, or it could be in the very reminiscence to that of someone else's, humans must, in some way or form, sacrifice freedom and time for a plethora of ease to grasp on the wings of flight which productivity is to wear onto itself. Since there are to be a panorama of expectations imposed upon oneself when in its earliest tenure of education, as in this video, our primary and substantial focus is to undulate over only schools, but these are to be the very epitome of the concurrent streams of depressions that are to occur subsequently. Let me share you a chart and make you witness this research and statistics that have been taking place over years. Again, the link to this entire documentation of an article will be in the description for you as an audience to scour upon ever after. This consists of the statistics regarding work culture in the Americas, Japan, and Europe. As a byproduct of an outcome, the stats are to be beyond that of staggering. For in this chart, the number of people that were unhappy were quite to that of a colossus and retrospect to that of the number of people in the office that were content with the labors or work, let me to be precise. Again, this may vary for each country as the numbers are rather still quite a staggering lot as compared to that of the people who were content with. Since robots are to comprise of abstraction that is to make their character naturally bland and bleak, or Blake, They are to do their task without any hindrances for most of the parts of this equation, but as to that of humans, they are to be naturally filled and capacitated with emotions, and hence are to go through these notions all throughout their lives or even collectively. Moving on to the next segment is Encumberation, or I would rather say it as Forced-Strictness, which is to summon and call me onto the rays of the next note in the symphony. For if humans were to object, what would the other do? The plot is to go into either ways, or rather to diverge in its own descent, for only for the purpose of this video we are to only tremble upon the negative notions of the humdrum. Here one is to most likely impose punishment onto another through the hemispheres of dominance from power. This will result in strict actions which are to be imposed onto oneself. One is to not do an action. For example, one is to not do an action whilst at its own, then the other one who has imposed the duty onto it for a task is to either punish the other or impose additional force, that is, if its employee isn't to do the work on its own volition. To be precise, and let us to say that one is to not do the task of sweeping, which is the very duty imposed onto itself by another, that is its boss, then either it is to be punished or to be forced into doing the very task that is not to be under its volition. Now, as of the outcome of Encumberation is going to be divided into three sections, which is stress, anxiety, and depression. To get to the outcome, or rather vicariously catch the train that is to hold at the outcome, we must understand this identity of stress. Stress is rather the core that is to be written in the very ambience of the zipping that is to go along like a leaf. It is the notional or mental to the comportment of physical tension, which is to surface from any event or node of one composite. In this case, the outcome of the punishment that is to be produced in an industry is to diverge onto multiple rays, primarily a negative bead in a ball of virtuous stereo. When one is to assert dominance over you, you are to go into an overdriven reality of darkness, with the conveyor belts of frustration seeding rage and anxiousness. For example, in a long gamma ray burst of stress, one is to go in a hyperbole of anxiety, and this is to result in the birth and cooling force of chaos. Now moving on to anxiety, this note has called me again as if in a reminiscence to that of a magnet, but this multitude of sediments that are to be deposited contains one chromatic pigment called anxiety. It can mean that whilst being composed and engraved onto this constant manuscript of ballad, one is to make rash decisions that could hurt any and all moving forwards in this ballad of life. It is to make one feel and pass into the sea of immense pain and stars that are to shine different notions onto oneself. As of depression, this note or rather word is to be used in that of the entirety of one's muse as the beats and chronic waves go through and on. To get nigh to this node, I am to say that in one's relativity to another's experience, it is the chronic or prolonged longitudinal stretch of sadness and bleakness at an outcome they can do naught against. The duration is prolonged and elongated rather in a conceit of perseverance and revenant notions or over countless epochs or time. This can or is to rather create a hamper or humdrum to one's cerebrum of a brain, diverging concentration during an event, for it is to take time to adapt or shift away from such instances. In an environment such as that of a school, one is to always be in a constant of a peer pressure whether it is to be instilled culturally or at a biological level. For example, one is to naturally feel under the pressure to answer and concentrate onto reaching an outcome of certain answers, which could be just a tincture and yet a precursor to depression. In this very node, one is to experience hindrances such as that of the very incarceration of freedom. Once being in the very quake of this very epicenter of such a conflict like this, one is to be deprived and forced away, that is, from the aspect drapes of freedom. For the very obstruction and siege of freedom in one soul's ballad, we must understand or even comprehend the notion of oneself's freedom. In the lateral surface area of education, there are to be some people that are to promote and rely on to the students' words of autonomy and lapse of reliance onto others in their own spectrum of lives. For in our society, all or most of us are to think or rather fathom for a reality where the future humans are to operate on their thought and preferences of ideals, not that of the very future humans, where the future humans are to operate on their thought and preferences of ideals and not that of the very future humans. This would result in the very nigh robotic nature of oneself's person and eventually even to be etched onto that of one, even one's persona. For example, I will give a link to this article that you can read by clicking on the link in the description. For this article is to explain the very cause and effect of the very torment of the frolicking freedom. Now, the primary points in the spectrum are the compulsory attendance that is to be imposed from a young age at most countries. Then there is the removal of options from the flow state of one's literacy. The other points compose of forced associative collisions, including lack of autonomous actions, and the more eerie and funny part in this strife for freedom or even that of action is one's property is to not be of their own, for the others are to have right over materials and not us. Now moving on to the impeachment and canceling of curiosity. Before I start on to this apex of my video, I am to say a quotation from this essay of John Taylor Gatto called The Sixth Lesson School Teacher, where he is to mention the absence or rather impeachment of one's curiosity, for curiosity has no important place in my work, only conformity. For scientifically, most young ones are to waste and flush down time that could have been spent on from the very academic perception. In veracity, the schools have always killed my, or perhaps our curiosity. For the irony in this darkness is to be that one is to become the one to do well in some acts, but in the nigh future and long term one is to learn naught from these very abyss of acts. How, you ask? Well, it is rather simple, because as the hindrance voices force upon itself, the school, or rather the people inside the yard of school acts, are to generally steer away a child's curiosity. For it is to block and trim the very exploring of instances by you, for it is to make you read and do certain acts. And if you are to do elsewise variables, then my friend, scrutiny is to bulge outwards from all to greet you with negative nuances that are to become entire histories eventually. Moving on to the conclusion, here's the verdict. As we're gonna divide this also into three sections: guilty or not, dissent, and diverse dissent and perceptions. For the moral of this prolonged longitudinal ballad is to not take chances with children, for the rule probability is a hit or miss for oneself and others, or it is too dangerous for one to operate onto, for they, children, are to or perhaps not be capable and able to even that of mere survival. As for this note, the judgment of such a system like this is to depend on all of our shoulders, primarily all of your collectivity of dissents to say. As per my dissent or opinion, such a system is to exist, for it is vital, but I will elaborate onto my very dissent in a future video. But I must say, as for now, change is imminent and inevitable, and so is the change of such a system such as this. Moving on to diverse dissent and perceptions, as I am to conclude this chapter within this video, I must say one thing, for you all may have different dissents and even perceptions in your ballads regarding education in schools. For example, there is the very argument of utilizing your education to your fullest, or rather making the best out of it. Then there is also the very notion of demanding change in the system, also including dwelling and complaining onto past crimes of such systems in accordance to yourself. But in the end, flaws are flaws, and nothing is to be exempt from failures, fallacies, and even crimes. And yes, as always, I'm gonna conclude this video here, and hope you all enjoyed this video. It is a pretty long video, and I didn't expect to make such a long video on these kind of topics, but let me know if you really enjoyed it or not in the comments below. And speaking of the comments, you make sure to comment if you have any concerns or any questions regarding this, and also you can share this video for more propagation of such videos like these. And don't forget to like if you enjoyed it. You can feel free to dislike too if you disagree, and if you want to really disagree, you can leave a valid or any sort of argument in the comment section below. And also you can subscribe for more videos and click the bell notification to get more videos like this to your recommendations on YouTube. And also for further support, you can follow me on my social media. Here are the links: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and well, you can also follow me on YouTube. You can check my channel. And yeah, that's all. And thanks for staying till this very conclusion. Thanks for watching, and see you in another reality.